She walked my fence line on a Tuesday morning with a clipboard, a measuring tape, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been wrong before, or from never having been corrected. I watched her from the barn door. Didn't move. Didn't call out. She stopped at the third post from the corner, the one that leans slightly southeast, the one my grandfather set in 1981 with a steel bar and a level he still keeps in the workshop. She photographed it from 4 angles. Then she wrote something down, tore the top sheet off her clipboard, folded it once, and tucked it under the gate latch like a parking ticket. I waited until her car pulled out of the development entrance before I walked over and picked it up. Structural deterioration presenting negative visual impact to surrounding properties. Fine, $75. Remedy, replace within 45 days with HOA-approved materials. I read it twice. Not because I was confused. Because I wanted to remember exactly how it was worded. The fence she was citing had been standing on this property for 43 years. The HOA she was representing had existed for 14 months. I could have walked across the road right then and explained that to her. I could have pulled the 1981 survey from my filing cabinet, driven to her door, and laid it on her welcome mat before lunch. I could have ended the whole thing that afternoon. I didn't. Not because I didn't have the information. Not because I was afraid of the conversation. I didn't because Sandra Voss had just written down the first line of a story she didn't yet know she was writing, and I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. I folded the notice back along its crease and carried it inside. When someone mistakes your silence for surrender, and you let them, is that weakness? Or is that the only way to win something that can't be taken back? My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 48 years old, and I have never once in my life started a fight. That's not a boast. It's just the way I was raised on this land. My grandfather, Earl Marsh, bought these 43 acres in 1979 with money he'd saved over 11 years of working double shifts at a feed mill in Cookeville. He didn't buy it because it was cheap. He bought it because it was right. The slope of the eastern meadow caught the morning light at an angle that made the clover bloom 2 weeks earlier than the fields across the road, and Earl Marsh understood that 2 weeks of early bloom meant the difference between a good honey season and an extraordinary one. He built everything here by hand. The equipment barn. The hive platforms. The drainage channels along the low ground near the creek. He didn't hire out what he could learn. He didn't rush what needed time. His philosophy, repeated to me so many times it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like breathing, was simple: good work doesn't need permission, it just needs to be done right the first time. I took over the operation at 31, after his knees went and my father decided Tennessee wasn't where he wanted to stay. I didn't take it over because I had to. I took it over because when I stood in the East Meadow on a still morning in late April, surrounded by 43 colonies working the wildflower bloom, I couldn't think of a single place on earth I'd rather be. I run about 60 hives now, down from 83 at our peak. I sell at 3 farmers markets, supply 4 local restaurants, and ship small orders to a customer list that has grown entirely by word of mouth over 17 years. I have never advertised. I have never needed to. People from Nashville drive out on weekends to photograph the property. I don't charge them. I just ask them not to park in front of the barn gate. I am not, by nature, a confrontational person. I don't avoid conflict because I'm afraid of it. I avoid it because most of the conflicts people drag themselves into aren't worth the energy they spend on them, and I learned early that the ones that are worth the energy deserve more than a hot reaction. My grandfather had a saying for that too. He'd watch a younger man lose his temper over something small and say, quietly, the way he said most things, "Son, don't spend a $100 response on a $10 problem." Sandra Voss's violation notice was not a $10 problem. But I wasn't ready to show her what kind it was. Not yet. There's a particular kind of person who arrives somewhere new and immediately begins measuring everything around them against a standard they brought with them. I've met them before. They show up at county meetings with printed agendas. They file complaints about road signage. They send emails to township clerks about grass height along the verge. They are not bad people, necessarily. But they carry with them the unshakable conviction that the world as they found it is a problem waiting to be corrected, and that they are exactly the right person to correct it. Sandra Voss was that kind of person. I recognized it the first time I saw her, 3 weeks before the clipboard walk, standing at the end of her driveway staring at my equipment barn with the focused expression of someone taking inventory of a mess that wasn't hers to clean up. I didn't go introduce myself. I noted it, the way you note weather moving in from the west, and I went back to work. What I've learned over 48 years, most of it on this land, most of it the hard way, is that there is almost never a good reason to play a card before you need to. Not because patience is a virtue in the soft, decorative sense people mean when they stitch it on pillows. But because timing is a form of leverage. And leverage, wasted early, is just energy with nowhere to go. My grandfather didn't talk about strategy. He talked about beekeeping. But the principles were identical. He used to say that a hive never panics when it doesn't need to. That bees understand something most people don't, that motion costs energy, and energy is everything when winter is coming. You don't move until moving is the right answer. You hold. You wait. You let conditions develop. And when you do move, you move completely. I had carried that lesson into every difficult situation I'd faced on this property for 17 years. A boundary dispute with the Caldwell family in 2009, resolved quietly, without lawyers, because I waited 6 weeks before responding to their initial letter and by then their own surveyor had found the discrepancy. A water rights question in 2014 that evaporated entirely when I declined to escalate and the other party's attorney eventually advised them their claim wouldn't hold. Both times, the people pushing against me had interpreted my initial stillness as weakness. Both times, that misreading had cost them more than it cost me. So when Sandra Voss's violation notice sat on my kitchen table that Tuesday evening, I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel anger, exactly. What I felt was a familiar settling, the same quiet that comes when you see incoming weather and realize you've already secured everything that needs securing. I wasn't going to respond to the notice. Not because I had nothing to say. But because what I had to say would land much harder if I said it at exactly the right moment, and that moment had not arrived. Not even close. Let me be clear about what was actually at stake. It wasn't the $75 fine. I've spent more than that on a single bag of feed without thinking twice. The money was irrelevant. What was at stake was the fence itself, and everything the fence represented. My grandfather spent 11 days building that eastern boundary line in the fall of 1981. Hand-split locust posts, each one cut from timber on this property, each one set 3 feet deep in compacted Tennessee clay. He used no power tools for the posts. He said power tools made a man lazy about depth, and depth was the only thing that mattered when you were building something meant to last. The fence had lasted 43 years. It had aged to a dark silver that you cannot buy, cannot replicate, and cannot rush. It leaned slightly in 2 places, not from weakness, but from the slow, patient movement of the ground beneath it, the same ground that had been shifting in this county since before any of us were born. That lean was not deterioration. It was character. It was time made visible. If Sandra Voss's notice stood, if I ignored it, or failed to respond properly, and the HOA escalated, there was a real mechanism by which they could pursue the remedy themselves and bill me for it. HOA covenant enforcement, in the state of Tennessee, has teeth when a property owner fails to respond within the remediation window. I had looked this up, not because I was panicking, but because I needed to know exactly what I was working with. 45 days. That was my window before the escalation clause activated. Beyond the fence itself, there was a broader danger I hadn't yet confirmed but could already feel taking shape. If Sandra's committee had decided my fence was fair game, my equipment barn was next. Then my hive placement. Then my water access from the East Meadow Creek. Once an HOA establishes a pattern of successful enforcement against a property, the pattern tends to continue. I was not going to let this become a pattern. But I also was not going to fire back at a single violation notice and give Sandra Voss a clear target to aim at. The fence would stand. I was sure of that. What I wasn't sure of yet was how to make sure it stood in a way she could never touch again. That required information I didn't yet have. And getting it required time I needed to use carefully. The violation notice arrived on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Sandra Voss had walked the fence line a second time. This time she brought someone with her. A man I didn't recognize, mid-50s, khaki pants, clipboard of his own. They walked slowly, stopped at the same leaning post, and the man spent about 4 minutes photographing the base of it where the wood met the soil. Then they walked the full length of the eastern boundary, all the way to the creek edge, pausing every 15 feet or so while he wrote something down. I watched from the hive platforms on the upper meadow. Far enough away that I was just a figure in a work jacket to them, close enough that I could see the man point twice toward my equipment barn. I didn't go down. I kept working the frames I'd pulled for inspection and I watched them finish and leave. That evening I made my first note in a composition book I keep on the kitchen shelf above the radio. Date. Time. Description of both individuals. Direction they walked. What they photographed. What they pointed at. It was a small thing. A single entry. But I had learned a long time ago that the difference between having a record and not having a record is often the difference between winning a dispute and losing one, and something about that second walk told me I was going to need a record. Here is what that second walk told me: Sandra Voss was not a person who filed one complaint and waited. Most people, when they send a formal notice, pull back slightly afterward. They've made their position known. They wait to see how the other party responds. It's basic social behavior: action, then pause. Sandra had not paused. She had escalated within 48 hours, brought in what looked like a hired inspector or contractor, and extended her survey to include my barn. She hadn't waited to see what I would do. She had assumed I would do nothing, and moved accordingly. That assumption was the most important thing I'd observed so far. What does it mean when someone reads your stillness not as restraint, but as an open door? A person who thinks you're simply not going to fight back doesn't probe cautiously. They advance. They expand the target. They start measuring territory they haven't been given any claim to yet, because in their experience, the absence of resistance is the same as permission. I closed the composition book and looked at the eastern fence line through the kitchen window. The locust posts were dark against the late light. Still standing. Still exactly where my grandfather had put them. I picked up the phone and called the county records office to ask about their hours. I wasn't ready to play anything yet. But I was done waiting to find out what I was holding. The county records office opened at 8:30. I was there at 8:45 on a Friday morning with a cup of coffee I hadn't finished and the address of the property written on the back of a feed receipt. The clerk was a woman named Patrice who had worked that office for what looked like 20 years and moved through the filing system with the calm efficiency of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people came looking for. I told her I needed the original survey and deed history for my parcel. She had it pulled and on the counter in 11 minutes. The 1981 survey was exactly as I remembered from the one time my grandfather had shown it to me, years ago, when I'd asked him how he knew where the property ended. Crisp ink lines, official county seal, the surveyor's signature in the bottom right corner. I laid it flat on the counter and followed the eastern boundary line with my finger. And there it was. 8 feet. My actual property line ran 8 feet east of where the fence currently stood. 8 feet of land, a narrow corridor of grass and scrub that Sandra Voss and her new neighbors had apparently been treating as common ground, a casual walking path between the development's rear lots and the creek edge. I had seen people using it. Dog walkers mostly, and a woman who jogged the creek trail on weekend mornings. I had never said anything, because I hadn't known it was mine, not precisely, not on paper. Now I knew. I also found, in the covenant documents the HOA had filed with the county upon formation 14 months ago, a clause in Section 7, Paragraph C that their Standards and Aesthetics Committee had apparently never read carefully enough to understand. Existing agricultural operations established prior to HOA formation were permanently exempt from aesthetic and structural regulations. The exemption covered equipment, structures, fencing, and operational infrastructure. My fence. My barn. My hives. All of it. Untouchable. I stood at that counter for a long moment. Patrice was helping someone else at the far end. The office was quiet except for the hum of a heating unit and the soft sound of a file drawer closing. I had, in that moment, everything I needed to walk across the road, knock on Sandra Voss's door, and end this conversation before it went any further. I could have been generous about it. Shown her the survey, shown her the exemption clause, given her the chance to withdraw the notice quietly before anyone else got involved. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took me to roll the survey back into its tube. Then I thought about the man with the clipboard pointing at my barn. I asked Patrice if I could get certified copies of both documents. She said it would take about 20 minutes. I finished my coffee and waited. Over the next 3 weeks, I did very little that anyone could see. I went to the farmers' markets on Saturday mornings. I worked the hives. I repaired a section of the north pasture gate that had been sticking since February. I waved to the jogger who used the creek path on weekend mornings, my creek path, as it turned out, and said nothing about it. What I was actually doing was reading. I read the full HOA covenant, all 31 pages, twice. I marked Section 7 with a paper clip and noted 4 other clauses that would become relevant if Sandra's committee decided to expand their scope. I read the county zoning ordinances covering agricultural operations in my township. I pulled the building permit history for my equipment barn, permitted 1987, no violations on record, and added it to the folder I had started keeping in the filing cabinet next to my grandfather's original deed. And I watched Sandra Voss. Not in any dramatic sense. I simply paid attention. She walked the fence line twice more in those 3 weeks, each time alone, each time with the clipboard. She had begun, I noticed, to walk the full length of the eastern boundary and then continue along the rear of her lot, pacing out distances I couldn't quite interpret from the barn. Whatever she was measuring it more than once, which meant she hadn't yet found the answer she was looking for. Or she'd found it and was deciding what to do with it. Either way, she had not knocked on my door. She had not called. She had filed a violation notice and sent an inspector and walked my fence line 4 times in 3 weeks, and she had done all of it without once attempting direct conversation. That told me something important about how she preferred to operate. She liked process. She liked official channels. She liked the power that came from paperwork rather than from dialogue. Fine. I understood paperwork. I added the certified survey copy to the folder, closed the cabinet, and went back to work. On the 22nd day after the violation notice arrived, I drove into town and bought 3 security cameras. Not the cheap kind. The kind with night vision, weather sealing, and a local storage drive that backs up automatically every 6 hours. I mounted one on the barn's eastern eave covering the full length of the fence line. One on the equipment shed pointing toward the creek path. One on the front gate post covering the road approach and the development entrance across the way. I ran the wiring myself. Took most of a Saturday. When I was done I sat in the barn with a cup of coffee and watched the live feed on my phone, 3 clean angles, timestamp running in the corner of each frame, sharp enough to read a clipboard from 40 feet. I did not tell Sandra Voss I had installed cameras. There was no requirement to. In Tennessee, security cameras on private property covering areas visible from a public vantage point require no notification. I had confirmed this with a single phone call to the county sheriff's non-emergency line, framed as a general question about agricultural property security. The deputy I spoke to had been friendly and thorough. I thanked him and wrote his name in the composition book. The second thing I did was call Marcus Webb. Marcus runs a landscaping and masonry company 2 counties over. We've known each other since high school. He does fieldstone work primarily, dry stack walls, retaining structures, the kind of construction that requires more patience than machinery and tends to last longer than the people who ordered it. I didn't tell him what I needed yet. I told him I had a project in mind and asked if he could come out sometime in the next few weeks and walk the eastern boundary with me. He said he could come the following Thursday. I said that worked fine and wrote the date in the composition book below the deputy's name. The third thing I did was submit a written response to the HOA violation notice. Not a rebuttal. Not a legal challenge. A single sentence acknowledging receipt of the notice and stating that I was reviewing the matter. Signed, dated, sent by certified mail with return receipt requested. I wanted a record that I had responded within the window. I wanted their acknowledgement of my response on paper. Nothing in that letter told Sandra Voss anything she could use. But it started a paper trail that ran in exactly the direction I needed it to run. My single-sentence response apparently read to Sandra Voss as confirmation that I had nothing real to say. Within 9 days of receiving it, her committee filed 3 additional violation notices. The second notice cited equipment noise, specifically, the diesel generator I run during honey extraction season, which operates 4 to 6 hours on extraction days between the hours of 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Weekdays only. The generator had been running on this property since 1994. The notice described it as an ongoing nuisance incompatible with residential community standards. The third notice alleged chemical runoff from my hives into the shared watershed corridor along the eastern boundary. No evidence was cited. No testing had been conducted. The language was careful, alleged potential runoff, but the implication was clear enough. She was building a record of environmental complaint against a licensed agricultural operation that had been maintaining hive health standards for 17 years without a single county citation. The fourth notice returned to the fence. This one added language about structural hazard liability, the suggestion that the leaning post could fall and injure a resident using the adjacent corridor. The corridor, I noted, that ran along my 8 feet of property that Sandra had never acknowledged as mine. I added all 3 notices to the folder. I logged each one in the composition book with date, violation number, and a 1-line summary. Then I did something that cost me more than I let myself show at the time. I moved my extraction schedule. The generator work I had planned for the following 2 weeks, work that needed to happen before the summer flow peaked, I pushed back, rescheduled, redistributed across fewer days to reduce the noise profile while the notices were active. It wasn't a concession to Sandra. It was a calculation. I didn't want a noise dispute muddying the cleaner fight I was preparing. But it cost me 2 weeks of optimal extraction timing, and in a beekeeping operation, 2 weeks at the wrong point in the season is real money. I wrote the number down. Added it to the folder. Every dollar Sandra Voss cost me was a dollar I intended to remember. The HOA held its monthly open meeting on the second Thursday of every month in the community room of the development's clubhouse, a beige building with a stamped concrete patio and a flagpole that still had its grand opening banner tied to it 8 months after the development had opened. I knew about the meeting because the notice was posted on the development's entrance board, visible from the road. I did not attend. I had not been invited, and showing up uninvited to a meeting about my own property while I was still building my position would have been exactly the wrong move, handing Sandra a room full of her neighbors and letting her frame every question before I could answer it. But I had a neighbor, Ray Tilton, who lived in the last house on the development's south side, closest to my property. Ray was a retired highway engineer who had moved in 6 months ago with his wife to be closer to their daughter. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, grew tomatoes along his back fence with the focused dedication of someone who had found his post-retirement purpose. We had spoken twice over the property line, once about deer getting into his garden, once about the best hardware store in the county. He was not the kind of man who involved himself in other people's business. He called me the Friday morning after that Thursday meeting. He said he thought I should know what had been said. Sandra Voss had presented my 4 violation notices to the full membership, approximately 30 residents, Ray estimated, as evidence of what she called a pattern of non-compliance from an adjacent legacy property owner unwilling to adapt to community standards. She had used the phrase legacy property the way some people use the word old, technically neutral, unmistakably dismissive. Then she had said something Ray repeated to me carefully, the way you repeat something when you want to make sure you get the words exactly right. Mr. Marsh has had every opportunity to respond substantively to this committee's concerns. His silence on the matter tells us everything we need to know about where he stands. Some people simply don't understand that the world around them has changed. I listened to Ray read that back to me. I didn't say anything for a moment. How certain does a person have to be in their own power before they start reading someone else's silence as proof they've already won? I thanked Ray. I asked if he'd be willing to write down what he'd heard, as close to verbatim as he could manage, and keep a copy for himself. He said he could do that. I wrote his name in the composition book. Underlined it. 2 weeks after that HOA meeting, 3 things happened in quick succession that told me Sandra Voss had decided to stop working through her committee alone and start pulling in outside weight. The first was a certified letter from a law firm in Nashville, Hendricks and Morrow, 2 attorneys whose website listed HOA representation as a primary practice area. The letter was addressed to me personally and referenced all 4 violation notices by number. It stated that my failure to comply with remediation requirements within the original 45-day window, which, by the date of the letter, had now expired, constituted grounds for the HOA to pursue enforcement action including but not limited to direct remediation at owner's expense, escalating daily fines, and lien placement against the property. I read it twice. Set it on the kitchen table next to my coffee cup. Then I called an old friend. Her name is Carol Brightwell. She practiced real estate and property law in this county for 22 years before semi-retiring to a reduced caseload she runs out of a converted office above her garage in Carthage. We had gone to the same church for a decade before she moved. She is precise, unhurried, and has a particular talent for reading a document and telling you in plain language exactly what it can and cannot actually do. I drove out to see her that afternoon with my folder, the certified survey, the HOA covenant with Section 7 marked, all 4 violation notices, the Nashville law firm's letter, and Ray Tilton's written account of the HOA meeting. I laid it on her desk in the order things had happened. Carol read everything without speaking. It took about 25 minutes. I drank the coffee she'd made and looked out her window at the yard below where her husband was doing something complicated with a riding mower. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at me over her reading glasses. She said, "Daniel, their attorney sent this letter without pulling your county records first. That's either sloppy or arrogant. In my experience with HOA firms, it's usually both." She confirmed what I had already found, the agricultural exemption in Section 7 was unambiguous. Pre-existing operations were permanently exempt. The fence, the barn, the hive infrastructure, all of it predated the HOA's formation and fell cleanly under the grandfather clause. The Nashville firm's enforcement action had no legal foundation. She also noted something I hadn't fully considered. The survey discrepancy, my 8 feet of land that Sandra's residents had been using as a corridor, meant that every complaint Sandra had filed about activity on or near that boundary had been filed about activity occurring on my property, not adjacent to it. Her chemical runoff allegation. Her structural hazard claim. All of it referenced land that belonged to me. Carol asked if I wanted her to send a response to Hendricks and Morrow. I said not yet. She looked at me steadily for a moment the way people do when they're deciding whether to push back on something. Then she nodded once and said, "All right. But don't wait too long." The second thing that happened was a visit from the county building inspector, a routine compliance check, he said, triggered by a third-party complaint. He spent 40 minutes on the property. He found nothing. He left me a clearance form signed and dated, which I added to the folder. The third thing was a voicemail from a reporter at the local county paper asking if I'd like to comment on an ongoing dispute between a legacy agricultural property and a neighboring HOA. Sandra, it appeared, had decided that public pressure might accomplish what paperwork alone had not. I did not return the call. But I saved the voicemail. Time-stamped. Logged in the composition book. The folder was getting thick. Marcus Webb came out on a Thursday afternoon, as planned, 3 days after the building inspector's visit. He drove up in his work truck, parked at the barn gate, and walked the eastern boundary with me without asking many questions. That was characteristic of Marcus. He was the kind of man who looked first and talked after, which was one of the reasons I had called him specifically. We walked the full length of the fence line. I showed him where my actual property line ran, 8 feet east of the current fence, and he crouched down at the corner post, studied the soil, looked back toward the development's rear lots, and stood up again without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said, "You're thinking limestone." I said I was. He walked the 8 feet of corridor slowly, heel to toe, counting his steps. He looked at the sight lines from the development's nearest windows. He looked at the angle of the afternoon light and the drainage slope toward the creek. He was doing in his head what he did on every job, calculating weight, drainage, footing depth, material quantity, but I could tell from the way he kept glancing back toward Sandra's house that he understood this project was not purely about construction. He didn't ask me why I hadn't simply shown the survey to the HOA and been done with it. But as we walked back toward the barn, he said something that told me he already knew the answer. My daddy had a neighbor like this once. Over in Smith County. Filed complaints for 2 years straight. He paused. Daddy waited until the man had done enough that there wasn't a person in the county who'd take his side. Then he moved the fence. Another pause. Said it was the most peaceful thing he ever did. He looked at me sideways. "How long do you need?" he asked. I told him I wasn't ready to break ground yet. That I'd call him when I was. I asked if he could put together a materials estimate and keep it between us for now. He said that was fine. Have you ever watched someone understand a situation completely, and choose, out of respect, not to say so out loud? Marcus Webb knew I wasn't just planning a wall. He knew I was timing one. He shook my hand at the gate, got in his truck, and drove back down the county road without another word. By the time the 8th week arrived, Sandra Voss had filed 11 violation notices in total. I know that number precisely because I had logged every single one in the composition book with date, violation category, and a one-line note on what new ground each one attempted to cover. After the first 4, the pattern became clear. She was not filing complaints because she expected compliance. She was filing them because she was building a paper record, a cumulative case designed to demonstrate persistent non-cooperation from a neighboring property owner. In a county enforcement hearing or a civil proceeding, 11 documented violations with no substantive response from the respondent would look, to an uninformed reader, like exactly what she wanted it to look like. I was not an uninformed reader. But I was running out of runway. Carol Brightwell had called me on a Monday morning, her voice carrying the particular crispness she reserved for things that required immediate attention. The Nashville firm had filed a formal enforcement petition with the county HOA compliance office. A hearing had been scheduled. 31 days out. "That's your deadline," she said. Not the original 45 days. This one. A county compliance hearing was a different category of problem than a violation notice. At a hearing, a reviewing officer would examine the full record, all 11 notices, the Nashville firm's petition, and whatever response I brought. If I arrived without sufficient documentation, the officer could rule in the HOA's favor and authorize enforcement action, including the property lien Carol had flagged in the Nashville firm's original letter. A lien against this property. Against land my grandfather had paid for with 11 years of double shifts at a feed mill. I sat with that for a moment. "Carol," I said. "If I bring what I have, the survey, the exemption clause, the building clearance, the full complaint log, is there any version of this hearing where they win? She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which with Carol meant she was being precise rather than uncertain. No, she said. But you need to bring all of it. Organized. Cited. And you need the zoning office to confirm the wall permit in writing before the hearing date, not after. When you've been holding your cards for weeks, and the clock finally appears on the wall, does the wait feel like a mistake, or does it feel like exactly the right amount of time? I called Marcus that afternoon and told him I needed the materials estimate finalized. I told him to plan for a Monday start date 2 weeks out, 4 days after the hearing. Then I drove to the county zoning office and sat across from a zoning administrator named Gerald Fitch and asked him a very specific question about agricultural exemptions and freestanding dry stack limestone walls on private property. Gerald pulled up the relevant ordinance on his computer, read it, and looked at me. You'd need a standard construction notification, he said. No permit required for dry stack under 8 feet on private agricultural land with established exemption status. You just notify the office 72 hours before breaking ground. I asked if he could put that in writing. He printed it while I waited. I spent the 3 days before the hearing at the kitchen table. Not pacing. Not rehearsing arguments. Organizing. Carol had been clear about what a compliance hearing required, not passion, not presence, not the kind of righteous indignation that feels satisfying in the moment and accomplishes nothing on the record. What it required was documentation so clean and so complete that the reviewing officer could follow it without assistance, in order, from the first violation notice to the present day, and arrive at only one possible conclusion. I built the folder into a binder. Tab 1, the original 1981 survey, certified copy, with the eastern property line highlighted and a typed annotation noting the 8-foot discrepancy between the recorded boundary and the current fence position. Behind it, a photograph of the fence taken the week it was built. My grandfather had kept a project album, the way men of his generation sometimes did, and there was a clear dated image of the posts being set in September 1981, 11 years before the HOA's enabling covenant was drafted. Tab 2, the HOA Covenant, full text, with Section 7 paragraph C flagged and the relevant language underlined in red ink. Behind it, a one-page summary Carol had written, precise, plain, no legal flourish, explaining in 4 sentences why the agricultural exemption clause applied comprehensively to my property, my fence, my barn, and my beekeeping operation. Tab 3, the building inspector's clearance form from his site visit, signed and dated, showing no violations found on the property. Behind it, Gerald Fitch's written confirmation from the zoning office regarding the limestone wall notification requirement, no permit needed, 72 hours notice, agricultural exemption status confirmed in writing. Tab 4, the full complaint log. All 11 violation notices, in chronological order, each one followed by a single typed line identifying the specific provision of the agricultural exemption that rendered the cited violation inapplicable. This tab was the longest. It was also, I thought, the most important, not because it proved Sandra wrong on any single point, but because it showed the full shape of what she had been doing. 11 notices in 8 weeks. Each one expanding slightly beyond the last. Each one filed against a property whose exemption status she had never once checked. Tab 5, Ray Tilton's written account of the HOA meeting, signed and dated. Sandra's exact words, his silence tells us everything we need to know, transcribed in Ray's careful retired engineer handwriting. Tab 6, the security camera logs. 14 documented instances of individuals walking the eastern corridor, my eastern corridor, over the preceding 8 weeks. Time-stamped. Clear. I closed the binder and set it on the table. Outside, the evening light was moving across the east meadow in the slow gold way it does in late summer, the kind of light that makes the hive boxes look almost ceremonial against the tree lean. I had 60 colonies working out there, the same operation my grandfather had started on this same land 43 years ago. It had survived drought, disease, 3 bad honey years in a row, and the general indifference of a world that does not think much about where its food comes from. It was not going to be undone by a clipboard and a standards and aesthetics committee. When every piece finally sits in its right place, does the long wait feel like suffering, or does it feel like construction? I set my alarm for 6:30 and went to bed. The hearing was held on a Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock in a municipal meeting room on the second floor of the county administrative building. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a folding table at the front where the compliance officer would sit, and 2 rows of chairs facing it. The kind of room designed to make everything feel procedural and slightly exhausting. I arrived at 8:40 with my binder and a cup of coffee. Carol was already there, standing near the window with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, reviewing something on a legal pad. She nodded when she saw me. Sandra Voss arrived at 8:55 with 2 people I didn't recognize, a woman who turned out to be the HOA board secretary, and a man in a charcoal suit who introduced himself to the compliance officer as James Morrow of Hendricks and Morrow. James Morrow was perhaps 40 years old, trim and confident, with the particular ease of a man who spent most of his professional life in rooms like this one and had long since stopped finding them intimidating. He set a document binder on the table, thicker than mine, I noticed, and exchanged a few quiet words with the compliance officer before taking his seat. Sandra sat 1 chair to his left. She did not look at me when she came in. She arranged her own papers with the focused attention of someone performing composure. The compliance officer, a man named Douglas Hale, called the proceeding to order at 9:03. He summarized the petition. He asked if both parties were represented. He confirmed the record included all 11 violation notices and the HOA's enforcement petition. Then James Morrow stood up and spoke for 22 minutes. He was good. I'll say that honestly. He had framed the case carefully, not as a neighbor dispute, but as a question of community standards enforcement and a property owner's documented pattern of non-engagement. He walked through all 11 notices methodically. He cited the expired remediation window. He referenced my single-sentence acknowledgement letter as evidence of bad faith engagement. He argued that the leaning fence post represented a genuine liability exposure to adjacent property users. He did not mention the 1981 survey. He did not mention Section 7, Paragraph C. He had built an impressive structure on a foundation he had never bothered to check. When he finished, Douglas Hale made a note on his legal pad and looked at our side of the room. Carol stood up. She spoke for 9 minutes. But here is what happened before Carol finished, and this is the part that cost me something I am still honest enough to admit. At the 11-minute mark of Morrow's presentation, Sandra Voss had leaned slightly forward in her chair and, in a voice just audible in the quiet room, said to the board secretary beside her, "This is already done." 3 words. Quiet enough that Douglas Hale didn't hear them. Loud enough that I did. I sat with those 3 words for the remaining 11 minutes of Morrow's presentation. I sat with them while Carol organized her notes. I sat with them while the fluorescent light hummed overhead and James Morrow looked satisfied in the particular way of a man who has confused preparation with correctness. This is already done. She believed it. Completely. She had filed 11 notices, hired a Nashville attorney, convened a hearing, and built what she genuinely believed was an airtight case, and she believed it because for 8 weeks, I had given her no reason to think otherwise. The silence she had read as weakness had felt, to her, like a confession. I looked at the binder on the table in front of me. Tab 1. Tab 2. Tab 3. Tab 4. Tab 5. Tab 6. What does it cost a person, not just in time, not just in money, but in the quiet hours, to hold still long enough to let someone walk all the way to the edge of being wrong? I picked up my coffee cup. It was cold. I drank it anyway. Carol was ready. There is something nobody tells you about strategic patience. They don't tell you about the Tuesday evenings. Not the dramatic moments, not the hearing room, not the violation notices, not the Nashville attorney with his thick binder. Those are easy to endure because they have a clear shape. You know what they are. You know what they require of you. The hard part is the Tuesday evenings when nothing is happening. When the composition book is closed and the folder is in the filing cabinet and the cameras are running their quiet loops and you are sitting at the kitchen table where your grandfather used to sit, looking out at the fence line in the last light, wondering if the thing you are holding on to is wisdom or just stubbornness dressed up in better language. My grandfather built that fence because he believed that good work deserved to stand on its own terms. Not because it was legally protected. Not because he had documentation. Because he had done it right, and doing it right was supposed to be enough. I had spent 8 weeks watching that belief get papered over with violation notices filed by a woman who had lived next door for 14 months and had never once knocked on my door. Never once asked what the fence was, or who had built it, or what it meant to the land it stood on. She had seen it, measured it against a standard she had brought with her from somewhere else, and decided it was a problem to be processed. That indifference, not malice, just pure administrative indifference to the history of a thing, was what had cost me the most in those 8 weeks. More than the rescheduled extraction. More than the fines. More than the Nashville attorney's letter with its talk of liens. My grandfather had died in 2019, 3 weeks before his 89th birthday, in the same house where he had lived since 1979. He had never hired a lawyer. He had never filed a complaint against a neighbor. He had built things, maintained them, and trusted that the county records and the quiet testimony of 40 years of honest work would speak for themselves if they ever needed to. They needed to now. I thought about that on the drive to the hearing. Not as a burden. As a clarification. I wasn't sitting in that municipal meeting room for offense. I was sitting there for the principle that a person's history on their own land deserves to be read before it is judged. 8 weeks of patience had been the price of making sure it would be read correctly. Carol was ready. So was I. Carol Brightwell stood up, set her legal pad on the table, and did not raise her voice once in the 9 minutes that followed. That was the first thing I noticed. James Morrow had filled his 22 minutes with momentum, the practiced forward lean of someone accustomed to controlling a room's attention through sheer forward motion. Carol did the opposite. She slowed everything down. She spoke the way you speak when you're not trying to persuade anyone of anything, because the documents are going to do that work and your only job is to make sure they are read in the right order. She began with a single question directed to Douglas Hale. Before we address the violation notices individually, I'd like to establish the legal framework within which this property operates. May I submit Exhibit A for the record? Douglas Hale said yes. Carol placed a certified copy of the 1981 survey on the table in front of him. She gave a second copy to James Morrow. She did not give one to Sandra Voss, which I noticed, and which I think was intentional. Sandra would have to lean toward her attorney to see it, a small physical arrangement that quietly clarified whose room this actually was. This is the original county survey for the Marsh parcel, recorded 1981, bearing the county seal and the signature of the certifying surveyor. I'd like to direct your attention to the eastern boundary line. Douglas Hale looked at it. He was quiet for a moment. The recorded eastern boundary, Carol continued, runs 8 feet east of the current fence position. The corridor that the HOA's petition references as adjacent common space, the corridor cited in violation notices 7, 9, and 11 as the source of alleged hazard and runoff concerns, sits entirely within the Marsh property boundary. It is not adjacent to Mr. Marsh's property. It is Mr. Marsh's property. James Morrow had gone very still. Sandra Voss was looking at the survey in her attorney's hands with an expression I recognized, not anger yet, but the particular tightening around the eyes of someone recalculating a situation they believed they had already solved. Carol moved to Exhibit B without pausing. This is the HOA covenant filed with the county upon the formation of the Voss Ridge Homeowners Association, 14 months ago. I'd like to direct your attention to Section 7, Paragraph C. She read it aloud. All of it. Slowly. Existing agricultural operations, structures, fencing, and operational infrastructure established prior to the formation of this association shall be permanently exempt from aesthetic, structural, and operational regulations promulgated by this association or its committees. The room was very quiet when she finished reading. The Marsh beekeeping operation, Carol said, has been in continuous operation on this property since 1981. The equipment barn was permitted in 1987. The eastern fence was constructed in 1981, as documented by the survey and by photographic evidence I am submitting as Exhibit C. She placed the photograph from my grandfather's project album on the table, the one showing the locust posts being set in September 1981, dated in his handwriting in the lower corner. Every structure, every piece of equipment, and every operational element cited across all 11 violation notices predates the HOA's formation by a minimum of 26 years. The agricultural exemption clause applies comprehensively and permanently. She set Exhibit D on the table. The county zoning office's written confirmation. Gerald Fitch's signature at the bottom. I am also submitting written confirmation from the county zoning office that a dry stack limestone wall of up to 8 feet in height on private agricultural land operating under established exemption status requires no permit, only a 72-hour construction notification. Mr. Marsh has already filed that notification. Construction is scheduled to begin Monday. James Morrow set down the survey copy. He picked up the HOA covenant and turned to Section 7. I watched him read it. I watched him read it a second time. Then I heard Sandra Voss say, quietly but distinctly, to no one in particular, "That can't be right." And here is where I said the only words I spoke during that entire hearing. Douglas Hale had not yet asked me to speak. But he looked at me, the way compliance officers sometimes do when they want to give a party one opportunity to add something to the record, and I understood that the moment had arrived. Not the moment to explain myself. Not the moment to enumerate grievances. The moment to say one thing, clearly, in a room where it would be heard by everyone present and recorded in the official transcript. I looked at Sandra Voss directly for the first time since she had moved in next door. I didn't stay quiet because I had nothing to say, I said. I stayed quiet because I needed you to say enough. She looked at me. The board secretary looked at her clipboard. James Morrow was still reading Section 7. Douglas Hale reviewed Carol's exhibits for 11 minutes without speaking. The room held the particular silence of people waiting for a verdict they already know is coming but cannot yet say out loud. Then Douglas Hale set the binder down and looked at James Morrow. "Counselor, I'm going to need your client's association to show me the legal basis for enforcement action against a property operating under a permanent agricultural exemption that predates the association's formation by over 2 decades. I'm also going to need an explanation for why 11 violation notices were filed against activity occurring on land the survey shows belongs to the respondent." James Morrow said he would need time to review the materials. Douglas Hale said he had 15 minutes. He came back in 12. He spoke quietly to Douglas Hale for approximately 90 seconds. I could not hear the words, but I could read the posture, the particular forward lean of a man managing a retreat while trying to make it look like a pivot. Douglas Hale made a final note on his legal pad. "The enforcement petition is dismissed," he said. "All 11 violation notices are vacated on grounds of inapplicability under the permanent agricultural exemption. The respondent's property boundary as established by the 1981 survey stands as recorded. This proceeding is closed." He gathered his papers. The fluorescent light hummed. Someone's chair scraped back. Sandra Voss sat very still for a moment. Then she began collecting her papers with the focused, careful movements of someone concentrating hard on a small task because the large one has just collapsed entirely around them. I closed my binder, picked up my cold coffee cup, and looked out the window at the parking lot below where the morning light was coming in flat and clean off the asphalt. Justice that arrives at exactly the right moment doesn't just resolve a problem. It answers a question the other person didn't know they were asking, about what your silence was worth all along. Carol touched my arm briefly on the way out. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Marcus Webb's crew broke ground on Monday morning at 7:15. For men, 2 flatbed trucks loaded with Tennessee limestone, and Marcus himself directing placement from the corner post with the calm authority of someone who has built enough walls to know that the first stone sets the logic for every stone after it. Dry stack construction requires no mortar, just patience, a good eye for fit, and the understanding that weight and friction, properly arranged, are stronger than anything you can mix in a bucket. I brought coffee out at 8 o'clock. Marcus took the cup without looking away from the work. 11 days, he said. Give or take. It took 11 days. 7 feet tall. Tennessee limestone, tight-fitted, running the full length of the eastern boundary on my 8 feet of land, every inch of it legally confirmed, zoning notified, exemption protected. It does not lean. It does not apologize. It sits on this earth the way my grandfather's fence post sat on it, like something that has always been here and intends to remain. On the 4th day of construction, the HOA filed an emergency complaint with the county building inspector. The inspector drove out, reviewed Gerald Fitch's written confirmation, and left within 20 minutes. Case closed. On the 6th day, Sandra Voss left 2 voicemails with the county paper reporter who had called me weeks earlier. I know this because the reporter called me afterward, still looking for comment. I thanked her and declined. On the 9th day, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Their attorney, not James Morrow this time, a different firm, reviewed the exemption clause, the zoning confirmation, and the hearing transcript for the better part of an hour before advising them, according to Ray Tilton who attended as a resident, that there was no actionable path forward. The wall was legal. The property boundary was recorded. The exemption was permanent. The last stone was set on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus walked the full length of it once, ran his hand along the top course the way a person confirms something they already knew, and looked at me. Your grandfather would have liked it, he said. I thought about that for a moment. About Earl Marsh, who had built the original fence with a steel bar and a level, and the conviction that good work didn't need permission, it just needed to be done right the first time. About 11 days in 1981 and 11 days now, separated by 43 years, and one woman with a clipboard who had never thought to check the county records before she started writing notices. The wall doesn't just block Sandra Voss's view of my fence. It blocks her view of my entire property. She still lives next door. We have never had a direct conversation. Her clipboard walk stopped the day the last stone was set. The creek corridor, my creek corridor, is quiet on weekend mornings now. The jogger still comes sometimes. I still don't say anything. The land is mine. The record says so. That has always been enough. Some problems, it turns out, don't need to be argued. They need to be outlasted, outdocumented, and outbuilt, until the only thing left to say has already been set in stone. My grandfather built something meant to last. So did I. If you've ever held your ground quietly while someone mistook your patience for weakness, drop a comment below. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply wait for the right moment to let the truth speak for itself.
Here's what this story was really about. It wasn't about a fence. It wasn't about a HOA fine or a leaning post or even 43 acres of Tennessee land. It was about something much older than any of that. It was about what happens when someone arrives somewhere new, looks at everything that came before them, and decides that history doesn't count unless they recognize it. Sandra Voss never saw a fence. She saw an obstacle. She saw something that didn't match the standard she had carried with her from wherever she came from. And she moved to correct it the way people like her always do. Not with a conversation, with paperwork, with process, with the assumption that institutional pressure, applied consistently enough, will eventually break anyone who doesn't know how to fight back. That was her mistake, not the legal one, though that was catastrophic. The deeper mistake was this. She confused Daniel's silence for ignorance. She had never considered the possibility that stillness could be a strategy, that a man who doesn't respond might be a man who is building a response. That patience, in the right hands, isn't passivity, it's construction. Every notice she filed went into a folder. Every overreach was logged, dated, and witnessed. While she was writing violations, he was building a case so airtight that by the time they sat in that hearing room, there was no version of events where she walked out ahead. She handed him the victory, one clipboard walk at a time. And here's the thing about people who abuse systems. They rely on the fact that most people don't understand the systems they're being abused by. Most people react. They get emotional. They fire back too early, without documentation, without legal footing, without the evidence trail that turns a dispute into a decision. Daniel did none of that. He went to the county records office. He read the covenant she was citing against him and found the clause she had never bothered to read. He let her attorney build an entire case on a foundation neither of them had checked. And then, calmly, with 9 minutes and 6 exhibits, he watched it fall. He didn't win because he was louder. He didn't win because he was angrier. He won because he understood something most people forget when they feel threatened. The truth doesn't need to be rushed. It needs to be ready. That's the real lesson here. Not just about HOAs. Not just about property law. When someone comes at you with process and paperwork and the confidence of someone who has never been checked, the answer isn't emotion. The answer is preparation, documentation, timing, knowing exactly what you're holding before you show a single card. Most of us have met some version of Sandra Voss. Maybe not in a homeowners association. Maybe at work. Maybe in a family dispute. Maybe in a system that assumed you didn't know your rights because you hadn't said anything yet. The question is, what do you do when you feel that pressure building? Do you react the moment it starts? Or do you hold still, take notes, and wait for the right moment to let the truth do the work for you? Tell me in the comments. At what point in this story would you have stopped waiting? And would that have been the right call? If you want more stories about quiet preparation beating loud authority, I'll be here.